Subtitles by ZDF 2021. Ladies and gentlemen, as you saw, I've slightly changed the lecture title because in Islamic theology, interpreting the Quran is really all about translation. Every translation of the Quran is an interpretation. We'll go into that in more detail later. To give you a little glimpse, here's the strikingly beautiful first page of a translation of the Quran that was published in Germany in 1916 by Lazarus Goldschmidt, who became even more famous for his translation of the Talmud. Indeed, translating the Talmud and the Quran is a colossal accomplishment, but the Quran has only one volume while the Talmud has 12. That's a huge translation achievement, but I'm only showing you this because it's a really beautiful page here too. But I want to start with a different topic, with another, yes, a different topic, a different place. Here you can see a hint of it, a Chinese translation of the Quran. A few years ago, the topic of the Frankfurt Book Fair was the Arab world. And of course, as an Islamic scholar, where do you go first? To the countries where there are books to be acquired, where there is something interesting to see, also something interesting from a technical point of view. And so, among other things, my path led me to the booth of Saudi Arabia, which was, of course, particularly magnificently decorated. And the focal point of Saudi Arabia was, of course, the Quran. And there the so-called, as I call it, King Fahd establishment for the printing and distribution of the Holy Quran exhibited the Quran. It was a wonderfully embellished Quran, and a great many Qurans were on display there. I'm showing you one such Quran here in German, an Arabic-German edition, a bilingual edition. And the whole thing, by the way, I didn't get it as a gift there, but I got it as a gift from the Central Council of Muslims. But here it is expressly stated, not for sale. This copy of the Quran with the translation of its meanings is a gift from the servant of the two holy cities, King Fahd ibn Abd al-Aziz al-Zuru. In fact, you can't buy this book either, so it's indeed not for sale. It's being distributed. And the special thing about it is this, and that I wanted to demonstrate to you with this picture and the beautiful Chinese title page. Quran translations are printed in many different languages. In this complex, it's called in English a Quran factory, a large printing house. And not just in the languages that are particularly significant for Muslims, where there are large Muslim populations, but also for languages that are possibly less important from an Islamic perspective. If you're interested in Chinese, you might say, well, Chinese doesn't play a significant role in Islam, but that's a big misconception, because China is one of the 10 largest countries in terms of the number of Muslims. And this now doesn't only apply to Western China, where there is a Turkish Uyghur population, but also to Central China itself, where there is a Chinese community which can look back on an impressive history of more than 1,000 years. I had the opportunity to visit a mosque in Beijing, which you wouldn't recognize as a mosque. It looks like a very traditional Chinese pagoda, complete with all the spirits on the roof, which would generally conflict with the monotheism of Islam, but they have adjusted in a certain way. In any case, China is a very important country, and that's why there are various Chinese translations. There have been for years. For a scholar of Islam, the interesting part was not just the way the books were presented and the books themselves, but the fact that translations were distributed by an official Islamic institution in so many languages, and that in a very... Yes, so you can only translate the meanings. What this is something for translation scholars to contemplate. I myself recently worked with a dissertation written by a young student from Assa University, where there is a dedicated faculty for Quran studies and translations into various languages. At first, this terminology might seem overly pedantic. If we seek an explanation, we will also find an explanation for why Islam has long had and continues to have major reservations about Quran translations. There are even people who say you can't translate the Quran at all. But the fact, and I want to emphasize this emphatically, is made clear by the existence of this King Far-Ad project that for today's Islam, for Islam in a globalized world, Quran translations play a very important role. But of course, always with this caveat when it comes to Quran translations. Now, in Arabic, Quran actually means a lecture text, a reading, a recitation. You have to understand this if you want to comprehend this word. That doesn't actually initially refer to a book in the sense that we talk about a book, but a text that is presented orally, that doesn't first appear, so to speak, as a written work, but orally it has an oral form of existence. Yes, this is also known from antiquity. Even the epics were orally passed down for a long time, or also the sacred books of the Indians, the Vedas. They have an even longer history of transmission than the Koran. And the astounding thing is that despite the oral tradition, which is undeniably true for the Vedas, there is an enormous fidelity to the text. So, the prejudice deeply rooted in our European minds that only what has been passed down in writing is reliable is absolutely wrong. And if you fail to acknowledge this, then you can't fully comprehend the tradition of the Quran or the Vedas. Specifically, and quite typical for our versions of the Quran, it is the verbal tradition that vouches for the reliable transmission of the Quran. Thus, in Arabic versions of the Quran, you will always find some sort of a stamp or seal, even a signature vouching for the text's reliability by an authorized body. In other words, the importance is oral transmission, prescription. One thing is this, and the other is Arabic, the Arabic language. It may come across as trivial for me to emphasize here that the Quran is revealed in Arabic. It is similarly reiterated in the Quran, such as at this passage in Surah 41. Lord, the one who sends down from the All-Merciful, the Most Merciful, a book whose verses were explained in a lecture in Arabic, or as a Quran in Arabic for those who know. Now there is a second perspective that is important. It is repeatedly emphasized in the Quran that this Arabic language is clear. Clear or distinct, as we hear in our second Quran quotation now. Even at the very beginning of the surah, a point where it is particularly stressed. Here, they swear by the clear book. Behold, we made it an Arabic reading. So we made it a Quran in Arabic. Maybe you'll understand. So this is important. It is very emphasized that the message of the book, well preserved in heaven, is proclaimed in the language of the people to whom the messenger Muhammad was sent. Not in some foreign language. For example, it would have made sense to reveal this book in Hebrew, the sacred language of the Jews, or even in Syriac, the language of the Christians at the time. But that is not the case. It was in Arabic. Now, for early Islamic history, the Arabic form of the Quran was in, where it is pointed out with particular emphasis, here they swear by the clear book. Behold, we made it a reading in Arabic. Thus, we made it a Koran in Arabic. Perhaps you will understand? This is thus important. It is emphasized with all emphasis that the message of the book, which is safely preserved in heaven, is proclaimed in the language of the people to whom the messenger Muhammad was sent. Not in any foreign language. For example, it would have been obvious to reveal this book in Hebrew, the sacred language of the Jews, or also in Syriac, the language of the Christians of that period. But that is not the case, rather, in Arabic. Now, in the early history of Islam, there was no problem at all with the Arabic form of the Quran, for Islam was inseparably connected with the Arabs. And its spread was at the same time as the spread of the Arabic language, which incidentally is not much older than Islam. Traces can only be found a few centuries earlier, so it is a very young language among the Semitic languages. In other words, the spread of the Islamic faith went hand in hand with the spread of Arabic. And what happened is that important lingua francas of the new area of Islam's spread were quickly displaced. Namely Greek on one hand, then Syriac or Syriac Aramaic, which was actually the primary language in today's Levant, or even Coptic, which took a little longer. And above all, it must not be forgotten, Latin was indeed the most widespread language in North Africa. Pretty soon, there were no traces of Latin at all. Please remember Augustine, the Church Father, was of Berber origin and naturally wrote in Latin. Berber has survived, but only in isolated language groups, but Arabic has claimed victory here. That is, initially the Arabic spread in accordance with the spread of Islam. This is a very crucial point. This worked as long as Islam had to deal with a nation that had a very unique linguistic tradition, namely the Iranians, the Persians. In Persia, Islam encountered Middle Persian, a very challenging language that has been and continues to be researched here in Erlangen in a special way. This Middle Persian initially adopted the Arabic script, but the language has managed to survive. It is a language that is very similar to German, also because it belongs to the Indo-European language family. Persian has somewhat recovered, and the Persians have insisted that their language is also used, and it later became one of the significant languages. That means at the same time Islam had the task of translating this Quran in some way to bring it closer to the Persians. And that's what happened. There was a fierce dispute from the end of the 8th century whether non-Arabs could join Islam or not. And this dispute ended in favor of the question that it's also a religion for non-Arabs. So it is truly a world religion. One could not only refer to just one verse of the Quran, but it's a universal religion for all people. The Persians continually insisted that their language also has value. The Arabs countered by saying that the most beautiful thing is the Quran, which ideally should not be translated because the Arabs invoked their fame, their eloquence, and the ancient Arabic poetry, the beauty of this poetry, as well as the Quran, that the Quran was revealed in particularly beautiful language. And this beauty of the Quran is also the certification miracle for the mission of the Quran. In this context, we look at an interesting section of the Quran in Surah 11 as follows. Here it is about the question of linguistic superiority. Muhammad's opponents are addressed here. He simply made it up or just fabricated the Quran. Speak, bring 10 surahs you have invented of his kind and invoke God, invoke God's city, whoever you can, if you are truthful. So they say, he simply made it up response, say, bring 10 surahs you have devised and invoke God's city, whoever you can, if you are truthful. One must note that this word, this Arabic word surah, which today means a chapter of the Koran, when used in this sense, originally had another use. It essentially meant Quran, that is, a revelation, a recitation of a particular part. Only later did this term become narrowed down to the chapter of the Quran, and Quran was then used to refer to the entire Quran. Thus it is as if they are saying, although it only says surah here, kindly bring an entire Quran. You cannot do so. The Quran in your style, in the way it's revealed in the language, is inimitable. And so the doctrine of the inimitability of the Quran was born, which is of great significance even today. And we will see how this has now influenced the question of the translatability of the Quran. One can interpret this verse in such a way that the opponents are unable to present something with the same content, or one can interpret it in such a way that they are not in a position to recite or produce something that has the same linguistic beauty. And the doctrine of the inimitability of the Quran primarily refers to the linguistic literary aspect. And this language, how important it is indicated in Surah 17, a verse often quoted in this context, which goes as follows. Just a moment, I need to find the passage. This is from Surah 17, verse 88. Essentially it says, if humans and jinn were to join forces to present something equivalent to this recitation, they could not present anything equivalent to it, even if they assisted each other. So once more, if humans and jinn, in other words, if people and spirits were to join together to create something equivalent to this recitation, this Quran, they would not be able to, even if they assisted each other. Now this inimitability of the Quran, the belief in it has led to Arabic scientists, or rather, scientists who speak Arabic, I must say, have put immense effort into proving it. The most famous scholar who did this was actually Persian, as with so many other things. Even the most famous grammarian, native to the Arabic language, is actually a Persian by birth. Understandably easy, they just had to learn a foreign language, and therefore thought about it in a very special way. This scholar was named Abd al-Qahir al-Jurjani, from the city of Jorjan in East Persia, who died in 1078, quite a while after Muhammad, during the peak of Islamic culture. He wrote two important books on proofs of the inimitability of the Quran and the secrets of the art of words, a kind of literary theory or rhetoric, however you want to name it. This book has been translated into German by a prominent Orientalist, Helmut Ritter, a wonderful book that shows how precisely Arabic speakers, the Muslims, observed and described their language. Among other things, however, also now using Aristotelian poetics. And this is the interesting part. These sciences of the Greeks were not unknown, but Islam partakes, inherits the legacy of antiquity, the Greeks. So it's not correct as such to deny it. There is a direct tradition from antiquity into Islam, and Muslims have often been the conveyors and also developers of ancient sciences, indeed even in such a central field. Science. Well, that was, in a sense, the literary linguistic dimension. From this theory of the inimitability of the Quran, there emerged a conviction of the untranslatability of the Quran. So if the Koran is linguistically inimitable, then it's logical to say that it is also naturally untranslatable. Well, that led to the belief that, legally speaking, the recitation of the Koran is permissible only in Arabic. So in worship services, but also for private use for edification, that is the rule. Only certain exceptions have been made, again in relation to the Persians. One of the Islamic law schools allows it, but generally Muslims agree that the actual reading of the Quran can only be in Arabic. Please take the following into account, and that provides us with a bridge to understanding what happened next. The Torah, that is Jewish law, is always read in Hebrew in synagogal services. Always. It is read from a Torah scroll, which is not vocalized at all. Both Hebrew and Arabic are consonant scripts, marking only the consonants. You need to know the vowels, so to speak. That's what they both have in common. After this reading of the Torah in Hebrew, in synagogal services, there was always an interpreter who translated the text into the common language of the Jews in each case. This has been the case since ancient times, so this tradition is well documented. Even today in Israel, there's still the case that for certain immigrant groups, this translation, this spontaneous translation occurs. And that's the way it is now, and that's very exciting for Islamic studies. A dissertation will soon be published, written at Harvard by a Persian, which proves that this kind of oral, spontaneous explanation, the translation of the Quran into Persian, has existed from a very early time. So it's difficult to prove this, because you have to meticulously look for traces in specialist literature and in Arabic Persian literature. Well, we consider a very important difference here. For the Bible, the original language was not so important in the spread of Christianity. Instead, people have tried from the outset to translate the Bible into the languages of those peoples they proselytize to. So it originated in Greek, then it was translated into Latin, and perhaps it is not known, but I'll say it here. To this day, the official language of the Bible for the Catholic Church is the Vulgate, the Latin translation. And an achievement of the Reformation, on the other hand, was that it said, well, we're going back to the original text, to Hebrew and Greek. But what's decisive is that translation was of great importance for the spread of Christianity. This is different in Islam now. I'm going to show you something now. So if you read the year 1830 here, then this number may surprise you. But it is difficult to find old manuscripts where the following is now the case. So this one is a manuscript from Raj near Tehran, from Iran in 1830. When you look closely now, you will see that a spontaneous translation is written between the bold Arabic text in reddish letters. So just as you as a student write over your zitra or whatever the words you don't know, that's not how it is here. It's a so-called interlinear translation, which doesn't offer a coherent text, but only explains what the individual words mean. That means it is actually completely clear from the outset who or what is important. The original text is the important thing, and the other, that takes a back seat completely. So it's difficult to find old manuscripts because they are usually not beautiful. In the illustrated books, one always finds particularly beautiful Arabic manuscripts, but not the utility manuscripts on which one does not know the manuscript. Just like the readers and scholars have ensured that the text is made understandable. Even back then, a large part of the Muslims were not native speakers of Arabic. One must always remember this. Even today, only a minority are real Arabs. You have to see that the others also need to be taken into account. This, by the way, is a shortcoming in local Islamic studies in Germany and Europe, that far too little attention is paid to other countries. So it's a highly Arab-centric Islamic studies, which represents less than half of reality. Right from the beginning, Quran translations, which I wanted to tell you about and explain, always included a tafsir, an explanation. And this explanation could very well be in a language that the people are familiar with. For a long time, this tafsir was oral and essentially an addition to the church service, to the religious events. A very significant Arabic tafsir, which is still significant today, comes from a Persian named At-Tabari. This is still one of the classic Sunni tafsirs today, and this tafsir was translated into Persian very early on, about 100 years after Tabari himself died. So you have to imagine that the acknowledgement of the content of the Quran in other languages took place via this way of explanation, of commenting on the Quran. Yes, and that is also the reason why people always talk about translating the meaning of the Quran. So it is always connected with some kind of explanation. Well, that has now changed, especially in India. Advanced information is needed for this. It is common knowledge that printing has been existing in Europe since around 1450. It's not generally known that printing in Oriental or Arabic letters or in the Islamic world as a whole only existed since about 1800. And of course, this had enormous consequences, because the distribution of such bilingual manuscripts, like the one I just showed you, was relatively rare. They were, so to speak, only intended for private circulation. And this manuscript from 1830, this is now a date when printing presses had actually existed for quite some time. However, Muslims had been in contact with non-Muslims since the beginning of the 18th century. And this was much earlier in the Indian world than in the Middle East, so to speak, in a certain mass. And here we have to mention one man, an Indian Reformed theologian named Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, 1703 to 1762, who advocated quite emphatically for translations. Yes, in this plea by Ad-Dehlawi, he referred to an intriguing passage from the Quran at the beginning of Surah 14, mentioning that we didn't send any messenger unless in his people's language to provide them with clarity. So we didn't send any messenger except in his people's language to provide them with clarity. This is, therefore, an extension of the interpretation of this verse from the Quran. Muhammad was sent to the Arabs with the Arabic Quran, but for the proselytization of the Quran or for the mission of the Islamic embassy, the consideration of the respective native languages is equally important. Incidentally, Dehlawi was already able to refer to a classic Quran commentator, so it was not a new finding in that sense. But what's interesting is that this Indian theologian, who lived from 1703 to 1762, lived for a time in Hejaz. So he made his pilgrimage and then studied with scholars in Mecca and also in Medina. And what's interesting is that he was a contemporary of the famous Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, the founder of the Wahhabis. The two of them knew each other and had some of the same teachers. But the Wahhabis initially represented a direction that is now opposed to this form of. They were therefore rather hostile to it, but not Dehlawi. That this work now exists in Medina, which produces Quran translations, could somewhat be seen as a late victory for Ad-Dehlawi. In the previous slide, I'll show you that the oldest translations into other languages that were also printed were done in languages native to the Indian subcontinent. This began in 1828. I hope that the yellow is clearly visible. 1828 with a translation into Urdu. Urdu is therefore the language that is now the official language in Pakistan. Besides other languages, there are many other languages that are very closely related to Hindu, actually the same language, just with different scripts. Then the next language in India is Sindhi. That's the southern part of Pakistan, where this language is spoken. Then Punjab in Punjabi, Gujarati, which is in the west. That's how it is in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent now. Yes, even in Tamil, there was an early translation. There was an early translation in the South Indian languages. So you see, Persian, Turkish, Pashto, today's language in Afghanistan, they are much later. And the first translation now in a European language that was also relevant for Muslims, Sardinian, was only in 1895, very, very late. So it's very interesting that these oldest Quran translations are now printed in India, because the demand for these translations in India was especially large. Deglawi himself also penned an annotated Persian translation, because at that time in the 18th century, Persian was still the language of the educated at the Indian court. That was only during this time then that there was a swing in favor of Urdu. Yes, now I'll show you a print of such a bilingual translation, the Arabic Urdu, published in 1901. Here it is, slightly enlarged. So here you can see what you've just seen in the handwritten version. You have the Arabic text on one side and the translation into Urdu underneath. So you can already see with the naked eye that Urdu is a more verbose language than Arabic. Yes, so the text is more extensive, but it's also simply more explanatory than the Arabic. Very concise, very succinct text, which, well, I can say it from my own experience, is very difficult for the Quran translator. Here you can see the typical form of an Islamic book in print. Text and commentary must be accommodated on the page somehow. Yes, that's it for now. Another thing that was of great importance for the Quran translations, for the globalization of the Quran, and is linked with the name of Ataturk. As you all know, Ataturk carried out a major script reform. That is, Turkish used to be written in Arabic characters. It was very uncomfortable, to say the least, for a language with 8 vowels to be transcribed in a script that's essentially designed for 3 vowels. So Ottoman Turkish was very complicated. Ataturk reformed the script in one fell swoop. Then came the question, what to do with the Quran? Ataturk wanted to set the Quran in Latin letters. And here you see a page from a Turkish Quran print from 1932, just a few years after the introduction of the writing reform. The Arabic text is paraphrased with Turkish letters, so you can read it without further ado. And this act of Ataturk caused a storm of indignation, especially at Al-Azhar University, and there were also lively discussions in the magazine of Al-Azhar, where the debate was hot on the pros and cons. I can draw a line from that era to the present day. If you surf the internet and search for the Quran, yes, finding Quran transcriptions in Latin letters is not at all anything special. Yes, but it has somewhat established itself through habit. So what scholars argued about back then, and thus with excommunication, the threats continued, but today it's really not an issue anymore. This shows how adaptable Islamic law is in many cases. But in print, this practice of overwriting the interlinear translations continued to be practiced, or the translation on one side in Arabic and then on the other side in Latin, as is the case in this German translation, that you have the German text on the left and the Arabic text on the right, which is, of course, very comfortable. Here again is the Urdu translation edition. The exterior is very beautiful and also in a standardized format. In most languages, the books are decorated in this manner. And in this Urdu edition, you can see again, like in the older edition by Konig Fachhandwerk, the Arabic text, the Urdu interpretation between the lines, and a commentary on the right. And in the preface to this translation, there is now the following justification for translation. There is, it says, an absolute necessity to express those meanings of the Koran or its content in all the languages that Muslims use, so that their reading of the Koran or their tilawa, as it's called in Arabic, is not limited to pure devotion or the pure practice of piety, ta'abbud in Arabic, without understanding its content. So not just reading now in a foreign language without understanding it, but translation, so that you understand what you read. Yes, so one can perhaps, is it understandable with Latin for some of the listeners who still know the earlier Catholic Mass? With Latin also understandable? Yes, it's a very similar phenomenon, that there is a certain magic in Latin, just as there is a magic in the Arabic recitation of the Koran. Now, this emphasis on the level of understanding here is of great importance. Since a large number of Muslims now live in countries whose lingua franca is not shaped by Islamic culture as a result of the migration movement, Quran translations are faced with completely new tasks. Namely, to explain the meaning of the Quran in languages whose religious terminology is specifically shaped by completely different traditions. And that's very difficult. We will come back to this later. Well, the first of one, by the way, here was again a slightly enlarged form. Here you see again this beautiful way of explaining the text between the lines. The first English translation, made by a Muslim and published in 1930, was by a writer named Mamedyuk Pigsall, or I may be pronouncing it wrong, a very difficult name. This Pigsall was a travel writer. There are even a few books by him that have been translated into German, so he's an interesting writer. Around the time of colonial India, then converted to Islam, made journeys in India, also met many people, and then he published this Quran translation with the programmatic headline, The Meaning of the Glorious Quran. So the meaning of the glorious Quran. With this meaning, glorious, he actually adopts an Arabic self-designation of the Quran. Certain Quran editions always have this word as an attribute to the Quran. So here you see the original edition on the left, the first edition from 1930, and on the right you see a modern edition, because it's such that this English translation by Pigsall has an incredible distribution in the Islamic world, even to this day. So if you travel to Istanbul, for example, and see the book tables around the mosques, there's always Pigsall's translation. And it's quite a remarkable and good translation of the Quran. Well, Pigsall has also pondered what's really involved in such a Quran translation. Can the Quran actually be translated? It must now be understood in the context of the heated debate among Asa scholars, which happened around the same time. To the Quran. Here you see the original edition on the left, the first edition from 1930, and on the right you see a modern edition, because it is true that this English translation by Pigsall has an incredible circulation in the Islamic world up to and including today. So, for example, if you travel to Istanbul and see the book tables in the vicinity of the mosques, Pixel's translation is always there. And that is a quite remarkable and good translation of the Koran. Now, Pixel has also thought about what is actually associated with such a Koran translation, and that the Koran actually cannot be translated. And we must now understand against the background of the fierce debate among us scholars that took place at about the same time. And in his foreword, he now justifies this in great detail. Don't worry, I'll translate it into German now. The purpose of this translation, the aim is to show English readers what Muslims around the world consider the meaning of the words of the Quran and the nature of this book, in a dignified and concise language considering the needs of English Muslims. It's reasonable to assume that a holy scripture can only be represented by those who can represent it, by someone who is firmly convinced of its inspiration and message. This is the first English translation of the Quran made by an Englishman who himself is a Muslim. Only later were there more English translations also by Indian Muslims, since English is very popular in India. Now, Pickthall firstly addresses a problem that is actually a unique fact in the history of religion, that the Quran was only translated into European languages by non-Muslims well into the 20th century. One can note in parentheses, I am not aware of any Bible translation that has been made by a Muslim. It is possible that there is an older Turkish translation or partial translation commissioned by the Sultan himself, or that, for instance, a Muslim might have made a translation of Buddhist scriptures. This is actually very unusual and can only be explained by a certain confrontational stance between Muslims and Christians. Now, Pickthall addresses a very important issue and now continues to say that some translations include comments that are hostile to Muslims. And almost all of them use a style of language that is immediately recognized by Muslims as unworthy. The Quran cannot be translated. This is the belief of old-fashioned sheikhs and also the conviction of the translator of this book. Yes, and then, although he states that the Quran is not translatable, he translates it and justifies it, stating that the present translation is quite literal, and all efforts have been made to do it in an appropriate language. But the result is not that glorious Quran, this inimitable symphony, whose mere sounds can move people to tears and ecstasy. So this sentence is magnificent, because it contains the very sounds of which movement to tears and ecstasy, yes, the beauty of the Quran recitation that is necessarily lost in a translation, or much of it is lost. So this has been Pixel now, and two things are important that we record. Firstly, he quite rightly criticizes the often fine targeted comments, and secondly, that he says that the language, the style of language, is often not appropriate. Well, and this leads us to the question, how did the Quran come to Europe in the first place? How did it work? And here we have to mention the name of Peter Venerabilis, an abbot of the Benedictine Reform Order of Cluny, who started an enterprise to have the Quran translated into Latin in connection with the Crusades. And this happened on a journey that Peter Venerabilis undertook to Spain to open monasteries there, that he provided a preface to it. Philip Melanchthon also provided a preface. It will be on a different edition. And the editor who made this print possible is a Zurich theologian named Theodor Bibliander. So 400 years later, the first print of the Quran in a European language. In a letter to the City Council of Basel, Luther has now stated the following. Luther has said, "The book was not initially approved by the censors. The printer even had to go to jail temporarily, so that the publisher had to find someone who would ensure that the book could finally be published." And Luther writes to the City Council of Basel. And these words essentially determine the attitude towards the Koran on the Christian side for many, many decades, even centuries. The reading of the Koran, so Luther writes, has moved me to that nothing more grievous can be done to the Turks, nor can it cause them more harm than all the weapons, than to bring their Koran into the day among the Christians, where they might see what a cursed, shameful, desperate book it is, full of lies, fables, and all the abominations which the Turks hide and embellish. And as a proof, they reluctantly see that the Koran is interpreted in another language, for they feel it does them a great deal of damage to all reasonable hearts. So there are several accusations in here, but Luther has, and this is interesting about this statement, somehow realized that Muslims do not like to see the Quran translated. Well, this book has had a long effect. It was first translated into Italian, then from Italian into German by a Nuremberg pastor at the Frauenkirche, Salomon Schweiger, who himself was in Turkey on an embassy trip, and there he found the Italian Quran and then translated it. So this is the first complete translation of the Quran. And for the next 150 years, Nuremberg is actually a center of interest in the Quran because several editions of this book and revisions appear. Please keep in mind, it is the time of the second wave of Turkish wars, so a time when people were very interested in the Turkish faith. So I just wrote down here that it was published in 2 editions. Well, what Schweiger was the first to do is that he meticulously recorded and commented on everything that deviates in any way from the Bible. So the Quran was perceived as a worse Bible, as the falsified Bible, and so one could not be reassured by the fact that this was established again and again. So, on the one hand, the false prophet, and on the other hand, the false, defective, flawed Bible. The most powerful work that has appeared in this context comes from an Italian, a Father Ludovico Marazzi, who was also the confessor to a Habsburg emperor. And this Marazzi has now first published an Arabic Quran text. That's another problem. You had to have Quran texts first. Actually, Muslims were not allowed to give the Quran text to unbelievers, but Marazzi had a Quran because the Vatican Library has also been collecting Arabic manuscripts since ancient times. He published this Quran text in Arabic, which is a good edition, by the way, and also translated it into Latin very precisely. Then he translated excerpts from Arabic commentaries into Latin and then wrote a detailed refutation on the basis of Catholic doctrine. This book is the most detailed one available for a systematic refutation of the Quran. I question the current relevance of this aspect of the work, but philologically it's an excellent translation. I must admit that I still use it from time to time. Indeed, the Quran then started attracting more interest from Western science, and what I have here is not the oldest German translation that was made directly from Arabic during Goethe's time, who had strongly criticized it, but rather a translation from the year 1840. That is by Ludwig, or originally Leon Baruch Ullmann, a Jewish scholar, later became chief rabbi in Krefeld. The important thing about this translation at that time was the following, and this still represents a certain value of this translation today. that Ullmann had a fellow student, Abraham Geiger, who later became one of the great Reform Jews in Germany. And this Geiger wrote an important dissertation on Hebrew, or traces now of the Hebrew tradition in the Koran, under the heading, "What did Muhammad borrow from the Jews?" And Ullmann has now used this in his annotations to the Koran, and thus as the first to promote an important comparative religion, historical treatment of the Koran. The first translation by a Sunni Muslim was not published until 1996, that is, by a German-speaking, I would say again, a German-speaking Sunni Muslim from 1996 simultaneously in Islamabad and in Munich. And I mention these translations now because they illustrate very well the difficulties that translators struggle with precisely in creating a specific religious terminology which is now distinctly separating itself from biblical terminology, which is familiar to us as religious vocabulary. The same is done by another very prominent Muslim, Murad Wilfried Hoffmann, whose translation was published in 1998, republished in Germany in 2001, and is still available today from Diederik's Verlag. With Hoffmann, it is not a new translation, but a translation that improves on an older translation from 1901. I have to say, not always improved, but in many cases worsened. This is the translation by Max Henning from the year 1901, published by Reclam Verlag. So you see here the unadorned title page of Reclam. It flourished a lot, so it was a best-selling book. And after the war, after the Second World War, there was an absolute lull for a long time as far as German Koran translation was concerned. That just wasn't the issue. It was not until 1960 that the well-known Orientalist Anne-Marie Schimmel reprinted this translation practically unrevised. So she only changed a few comments. She didn't always have the whole thing now in the sense of pixel-friendly climate, which would therefore be necessary to use respectful language. She didn't always pay attention to. Interestingly, Surah 4 is still called the women, which today would probably be translated as the women. And it is curious that the edition that was then published in East Berlin in 1968, supervised by a religious scholar named Kurt Rudolph, also makes women women, and also changes many other things. The fact that these two issues existed was due to the division of the advertising publishing house because of East and West Germany. I don't need to elaborate here. It's interesting that the Turkish organization DİTİB also made this edition of the Quran the basis, a bilingual edition for guest workers. Unfortunately, it wasn't taken into account that this edition is very erroneous and contains many text omissions and simple grammatical errors, which you wouldn't easily let pass in a modern Quran translation. Well, now I come to the end of my talk about some problems regarding the translation of certain terms. A very important word in the Arabic text is the word mushrik, which means something like someone who gives another a partner. That would be the very literal translation. A similar word to sharik, so practically the partner, is still a common word today. If you have a business and brothers and company, or brothers and brothers anyway, then here is the corresponding Arabic word. So mushrik is someone who gives another a partner, and in that sense, by the way, is also used in the Quran in Arabic. In reference to Moses, that is, God places Aaron by Moses' side as a partner. Yes, so that's the meaning of this word here. How is this now translated into German? So a translation that I have chosen for certain reasons, which I will explain later, is associate. It might sound a bit old-fashioned, and you might not immediately know what it means. But what are the alternatives? Pagans, a very Christian term, is often associated with the concept of idolatry, or the worship of false gods. And this is even emphasized by the translations polytheists or idolaters, which are even more blunt. So I am now just ruling out these three possibilities. But if you closely examine the Quranic text, considering all the places where these mushrikun are mentioned, it is quite possible that they are people who worship saints or angels. And it's also not clear whether Christians now clearly fall under these cosellas or not. Some believe that the Trinity should be viewed as such a phenomenon. So that's why I refrained from such words as pagans, polytheists, idol worshippers, and took the more neutral cosellas. Even though it's a bit outdated word, it has the widest range of meaning, because all these phenomena, worship of saints, worship of angels, but also idolatry, can all be included under it, meaning you translate as broadly as possible. Now I'll mention another translation of the Quran that is a very good one in my opinion, but it is not widespread at all. It's a translation commissioned by the Asa Mosque and was prepared by a German, an Egyptian Germanist. Mustafa Maher, an important Germanist, with a foreword by Muhammad Saeed Tantawi, the previous Sheikh of Al-Asha, who passed away last year, and a prologue by a very esteemed religious scholar who also studied in Germany and is a highly respected man, rather attributable to liberal Islam, Muhammad Sagzug. What distinguishes this translation, I'll tell you right after this. Unfortunately, this translation is hard to come by. I don't understand it, why it isn't available in bookstores here, probably because it's a very extensive and also very expensive book. Now, a Syrian named Amir Saidan takes a very extreme position. He calls this translation al-tafsir, which means the commentary, a philologically, Islamologically sound explanation of the Quranic text. And now he chooses to follow this path, that he does not translate certain terms in the Quran, this term for instance, into German at all, but leaves it in Arabic, like a foreign word, so to speak. This means at the end, this translation can really only be understood by experts. He then says at some point, this is actually kind of an introduction now to learning the Arabic text, but it is indeed irritating. Sometimes it borders on things where you're more likely to laugh than understand it. So when, for example, a God-fearing person is called a mutaki, or a believer a mu'min. So my first thought was, there was once a satire series where they talked about the mu'mins, and if you're old enough to remember it, you'll associate it with that. So it's exactly the kind of language Pixel criticized as being unseemly or unworthy. And with that, I would like to conclude. I want to show you with a few key examples, namely the word kafir. The kafir is a term that is somewhat aged in German as well. This harkens back to the time when Germans were still colonial masters. Today's Tanzania, which was predominantly populated by Muslims, and for which there were also instructions for officials on how to handle Islamic law. In other words, a textbook of Islamic law, specifically made for the situation in East Africa. That's where the kafir comes from. So kafir is a word that means either ungrateful in the Quran or ungrateful. How to translate it, but it's clear. These are the meanings, so to speak. There's another word, kafur, that sounds similar and actually means the same thing. Now, in von Denver's translation, Ahmed von Denver, this word is translated as refusing to believe. Thanks, refusing. And here we see a trend that I personally disapprove of, that this word now takes on an intentionality it doesn't inherently have. Kafur essentially just notes something. But here, if I say refusing to believe, then it's someone who wants it that way. So this element of wanting is being read into it. But that's actually the Arabic meaning of the word, as I see it and as I translate it, now having consulted relevant lexical resources. Does this lead in a different direction? So now you have Amin's tafsir translation here, where the foreign words have been left in. So the kafur is now someone who practices kufur? Yes, so kufur is a noun that belongs to it, that is unbelief, or extremely practicing kufur. And these are precisely the forms of translations where I would say that this is not appropriate language. Nothing comes across now from the peculiarity of the language form and also the message of the Koran. You rather close it unsatisfied. And with that, we come to the hardest question of a translator, and I also want to conclude with that. Namely, how do I deal with Allah? So you can somewhat divide the translation of the Quran into the group of Allah translations and the group of God translations. What does Allah mean? There's an Arabic singular form which is called ilahun, and so you can easily see that they are somehow connected. Yes, according to the structure of the Arabic language. Ilah is a deity. That is a kind of generic term to which there could also be a plural, namely deities. But that's not possible with God. God is not capable of being plural. So Allah in this sense, yes, because it's actually a contraction originating from this word al-ilah. The I is omitted, and then the word Allah arises from it, practically the God par excellence. And what's important now, if you do a little philology and look at Semitic studies, so the other Semitic languages, then you'll find that this Arabic word, Ilah, corresponds to the Hebrew word Eloah, as an old relationship. And in Hebrew, the plural Elohim is now often used for God par excellence. So what I would like to say, which is to the Hebrew Elohim, is to the Arabic Allah. Yes, and the bottom line is this. If you open an Arabic Bible, what do you find there? There you'll find nothing but Allah. For both Christians and Jews, Allah is the only possible word for God. And let me add that the Quran's message ties into this pre-existing imprint from pre-Islamic Arabia. I would like to share an important passage from the Quran with you. Allah is not a proper name for the Islamic God, but it's the general term for God across all three monotheistic religions. And in Surah 29, verse 46, it reads, "Argue with the people of the book, Christians and Jews, only in a polite way, but not with those who are unjust." Speak up. We believe in what has been revealed to us and what has been revealed to you. Our God and your God are one, or our God and your God are the same. We surrender to Him. Thank you for your attention.